Welcome to the second series of Suitable for Adults, popular children's Bible stories viewed through an adult lens. In this four-part series, we'll be taking a look at Old Testament heroes, but from the perspective of the women in their stories. In this video, we'll be following the story of Abraham and Sarah. In traditional retellings of this story and through songs, we learn a great deal about the faith of Father Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of great nations. He promised that Abraham would live in the land that he was shown, the promised land, and because of Abraham, peoples of the earth would be blessed. This is the story of the Abrahamic covenant, and it has a major lesson that God always keeps his promises, even the ones that seem impossible. Within this story, Abraham takes a wife, Sarai. Her ancestry is not clear. Genesis 11 tells us that Abraham and his brother marry. Abraham marries Sarai and his brother Milcah. It does not name Sarai's father, but it does tell us that Milcah is the daughter of Haran, which is Lot's father, so sister of Lot. Sarai and Abraham come to Israel as a part of God's promise of the numerous children and the promised land. Now, because of the nature of this covenant, we already see that Sarai has to play a very important role within it, as she will be the mother of the children that have been promised. God's promise, however, is almost immediately put into danger within the story. Abraham and Sarai are working the land of Israel, and they experience famine and must travel to Egypt for food. This story might feel a bit familiar if we think forward to the story of Joseph bringing the Israelites to Egypt and then later their exodus. And we'll see, too, within this story that God again, or perhaps before, uses plagues to deliver his people from Egypt. As much as we elevate Abraham to the point of hero within this story, it's at the beginning here that we start to see his doubt. And in fact, he commits, or almost commits, a very grievous sin against Sarai, nearly forcing her to commit adultery and pretending that she is his sister, both of which would have been very taboo within God's laws at that time. In fact, it is God and the near adulterers that stop this from happening, not Abraham. And essentially, this story is told twice in Genesis, both with the Pharaoh of Egypt and with the ruler of Gerar, who's Abimelech. In these stories, Abraham fears for his life, and perhaps rightly so. Because we know through other stories within the Bible and also other retellings within the time that it was common if a king saw a beautiful woman to take her and kill the husband, therefore not committing adultery since the husband has perished and gaining the beautiful wife. We also see this in the story of David and Bathsheba. So perhaps because Sarah is so beautiful within this point in the story, Abraham has a right to fear. So what he does is he pretends that Sarai is his sister, and he promises her to Pharaoh. And Sarai goes along with this, and some might wonder why, but perhaps at the same time her fate would have been about the same either way. In any instance, she would end up with Pharaoh, either with a dead husband, or perhaps she would have some familial protection through this perceived brother. Abraham not only saves his life, but he also gains a dowry from his wife, or a bride price. So he gains his wealth by selling off his wife in a sense. And Sarai, through it all, is dutiful to her husband. She goes along with his plan and doesn't fight him on it. which makes her the dutiful wife, and subservient, which some people take issue with, but in this instance raises her and elevates her. Now all of this is relayed very matter-of-factly in Genesis 12. In Genesis 20, we see the parallel story, and Genesis really does this a lot with two stories that are very similar, telling pretty much the same point but emphasizing it by doing it twice. But this time Abraham goes to the land of Gerar, and he tries to save his own life at the expense of his wife again. But the details in the second story are a little bit more expressive. They show concern about Abraham's actions, emphasizing that Sarai is still pure, that Abimelech never touches her. He never touches her. But that's because God intervenes. He sends dreams to Abimelech, and Abimelech becomes angry and gives Sarai back to Abraham. Angry that Abraham tricked him, and also that he nearly caused him to sin against God. Within this, the narrator shows a bit more judgment, as I said, towards Abraham, and Abraham shows more deference to Sarah. In a way, he calls her his half-sister instead of full sister in this case, and he makes it clear that the ruse is done because of her grace and because of her benevolence, that she sacrifices herself to save her husband. These stories are a little confusing, but they do kind of show and focus on Abraham's lack of faith in this part, and the importance of Sarah in fulfilling God's promise. The fact that Sarah becomes a slave in Pharaoh's house also serves to foreshadow Israel's later bondage in Egypt. Now, she would not have been in danger herself for her life, but the danger here, the reader knows, is for the birth of the nation of Israel, and her as the ancestress of Israel. Because if she's married to the Pharaoh, she can't be in that line to fulfill God's promise and bring about the covenant and bring Abraham's children, which would bring the people of Israel. So this is a real big problem in God's promise. So Sarah has to be faithful that she'll get out of this. And she sort of goes along with it knowing that. Abraham is really more in this story concerned for himself. So God acts to protect Sarah. And he does this by afflicting Pharaoh and his whole house with plagues. Until Pharaoh realizes that there's a problem and that problem stems from Sarai, and he sends her away. And we can then use this again to foreshadow Israel's exodus from Egypt, as God once again then uses plagues to deliver them as well. So they're then free of both situations, and they arrive back at their land. And there's still a problem. The other danger to the covenant is that Sarai at this point is old and barren. In this part of the story, we often find ourselves focusing on Sarai's lack of faith. In Genesis 16, 1 through 2, Sarai is about 90 years old, as I said. We'll skip the discussion about how they could have been so old in Genesis, and the length of time. There's a lot that could go into that, whether it's speculation of did they use different calendars or measurements of time? Was there a sort of miraculous thing happening through God that made them live longer, or cleaner air and lack of pollution that helped it? All of those things we're going to kind of gloss over for the sake of this video. And just know that 90 is referencing that she is long out of the way of having children. At this point, we see that she's in despair, because this whole time she has gone through these experiences and been brought out of Egypt and been brought away from Abimelech with this promise that she would be the mother of the nation. And so, like many women, she gets to thinking and problem solving and trying to figure out how she's going to make it work. She cooks up this plan that she's going to give her handmaiden Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate womb. This is a known custom within Mesopotamia, and so it wouldn't have necessarily been unusual. We do know that this is one of the first and older accounts of using a surrogate, but there are records that this would have been culturally appropriate. The servant may or may not have had a choice in the matter, being that she was owned. However, the child in this instance would have been considered free and legitimate because of the barrenness of the wife would nullify the wedding vows in this case. In fact, there are some more traditional Catholic or Jewish wedding vows and regulations that allow a Sarah rule. I believe Mormons have done this, and possibly Muslims also, where infertility is a big stumbling block. Where divorce is a sin, you can get things annulled because you can't help if you marry someone who is infertile. And the whole point in some of these faiths is that childbearing is a sacrament, or it's commanded by God that we bear children and be fruitful. That we bear children and be fruitful. And so you have to have a way to get around that. So there are some other rules that kind of go along with that messiness, but in some cultures you still can nullify even if you can't divorce based on infertility. And perhaps Hagar would have gone along with this because she probably would have also received some benefit herself, including freedom for doing this. So it's not necessarily true that she would have been forced into it, but it is true that this was a common practice. In fact, Alice Bach, the Archbishop Holohan Chair of the Catholic Studies Department at Case Western Reserve, said that taking secondary wives was a common practice in ancient Israel. What Abraham did to Hagar was completely legal. If your wife cannot have children, you can have children by your wife's slave. The slave is considered an extension of the wife, and therefore the child becomes yours and is legitimate. Sarai's plan, though, goes bad right away. Hagar bears a son, Ishmael, and she no longer acknowledges Sarai as the dominant wife and the head of the household. Sarai feels displaced, which might be justified since she's twice been discarded and sold off by her husband in his fear and self-preservation. Sarai then shows contempt for Hagar and treats her very harshly, believing her to not show her proper respect until Hagar flees into the desert, and it takes an angel to bring Hagar back. The angel tells her that her son is to be named Ishmael, which means God hears, meaning he hears her plight. At the same time, Sarah is so angry with Abraham, she declares that may the wrong that Abraham did to her be done to him. And also, may God judge between the two of them, between Abraham and Sarai, as to which one is more faithful. She may have felt at this point, probably, that her status as first wife was vulnerable. Because, as I said, Abraham could discard her. He could go with Hagar as a dominant wife who brought the promised heir, the promised son. But God tells Abraham to restore authority to Sarah. And he gives and makes clear that Hagar is under Sarah's control, but not Ishmael. Ishmael would typically also have been under Sarai's control as her surrogate child, but Abraham keeps him under his protection and control and protects him. In fact, it's Abraham who names and decides to call him Ishmael rather than Sarah. And this departs from other stories, like the story of Rachel or the story of Leah, who both have surrogate children and who both name and have control over those surrogate children. But Abraham seems very happy and content to consider Ishmael his child, the child of promise, and kind of in spite of Sarah. She's just sort of there because God says that she's still supposed to be there. He doesn't understand yet, though, her importance, that she's a part of that original covenant. It didn't matter to Abraham who had the child. But if it didn't matter to God, then why would God have protected Sarah in Egypt? And why would God have protected Sarah against Abimelech? He wouldn't have needed to, because she would be gone, and then Abraham would have taken another wife and had a child or gone through the covenant with her. But that wasn't the deal. The deal was to go through Sarai. And God informs him of that. He meets again with Abraham, and he says that Ishmael will have his own separate destiny, but that the promise was meant through Sarah. It's this time when God renames Sarai to Sarah and announces that she will give birth to Isaac. And it's this part of the story that's typically used as another way to diminish Sarah. So God comes and meets with Abraham with two other men. We see sometimes the paintings of the three men meeting with Abraham. And he's telling him the promise, and Sarah's in the tent. And God asks where Sarah is. And Sarah overhears God's promise, saying that he will give her a child, even though she's 90 years old. And so she does what I think a lot of typical women would do, which is say, I've waited all this time for your promise, and now at 90 years old, now is the time she's going to have a child. And that's difficult. The energy that it takes to raise a child, the health concerns alone of giving birth to a child, the risk that entails, especially when you're at an old age. And she laughs, almost sardonically, that how could this be happening now? Most people read this as she laughs because she is so unbelievable, and it is. But God hears her, and he asks where Sarah is, and he says, why did you laugh? And she lies. She tries to cover it up and say she didn't laugh, and he calls her out on that. It's worth noting that when Abraham hears the news of Isaac, he laughs also. But they say he laughs with joy, at the joy of this happening. And I'm not quite certain as to why we focus so much on the lack of faith of Sarah and her laughing this off, and yet Abraham laughs with joy when they both have shown moments of disbelief. So by the time we get to Genesis 21, God's promise is finally fulfilled. Sarah gives birth to Isaac. But this is where she really starts to falter. She worries that Ishmael is still the legitimate first heir, because at this point he is. There's also an incident later between Isaac and Ishmael. The Septuagint reads that Ishmael was playing with Isaac during his weaning. Some readers suspect that partly because of the way Sarah reacts, that playing with suggests some bit of abuse, perhaps physically, perhaps sexually even, but it's in the impropriety of the situation enrages Sarah, and because of the play. And however innocent either of them might have been, whether Ishmael was the problem or maybe even Isaac is then labeled as the one who plays. And Sarah doesn't want any of it. She urges Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael into the desert with only a small amount of food and water or supplies, thus basically dooming Hagar and Ishmael. And at this point, Somewhat surprisingly, God takes Sarah's side. And we might wonder why this is, but many think that it's another emphasis on Sarah's importance. Sarah has to remain the dominant wife, and at this point there is conflict, and you must choose the one who is dominant. And Sarah is the dominant wife. Hagar, of course, because of this fate, is in great despair. So God speaks to her and comes to her and promises Ishmael's line will become a great nation. And this shows her that God is going to save both her and her son. Traditionally, Jewish people trace their descendants from Isaac, Sarah's son. Muslims and Arab peoples trace their lineage from Hagar and Ishmael. Muslims see both Isaac and Ishmael as legitimate heirs. And according to Khalid Kashek, assistant professor of religious studies at DePaul University, in Islamic tradition, if a man sleeps with a slave, she is free, and the son has never been born a slave. And this kind of reflects the case in our story here. Muslims believe also that it was Ishmael and not Isaac whom Abraham was told to sacrifice. And perhaps that comes from this idea that Abraham was to send Ishmael out into the desert where he most likely would have perished, but then God intervenes and saves him. Perhaps that's where it divides. If, for instance, they would have gone and created their own story and their own history, that would have been their sort of sacrifice story. So it kind of lines up there. But they also credit Ishmael and Abraham with together rebuilding the holy city of Mecca, which would have been their promised land. Hagar also has become a symbol of other enslaved peoples. For instance, African Americans have appropriated her as a symbol of the plight of slave women who are often involved in various sex trades or are in situations where masters use them, impregnate them, and cast them out once they have children. So she's been used as this symbol within that culture and movement. Feminist scholars also often use this story and look and reflect upon it because of the male-dominated interpretations of the story, which often marginalize the women within it. Even though we've seen really that Sarah, in most of the parts of the story, are kind of on even keel with Abraham. God speaks with her also. He promises her things also, and constantly is saving her despite Abraham. But yet, the story is used to show her unfaithfulness and doubting many times, and glosses over Abraham's misuse of his wife and his own unfaithfulness, both of which would have been taboo. Even the idea of a male god having power over a womb, which is the one power that the woman had. In fact, it was her only value was to have children, especially a male heir, that God would be able to open and close it at his pleasure and have this hold over this woman becomes an issue for many feminists in patriarchal societies and in the male dominance within religion. But I don't know how much myself that we need to hold on to those ideas if they really come out of those stories themselves, or if those are ideas that are placed on them by us through our own patriarchal interpretations. But we can see that even though we call it the Abrahamic covenant, that the story begins and comes to an end almost with the women. It's through Sarah and even through Hagar that we get this birth of nations that is the promise to Abraham. It wouldn't have been fulfilled without either of them. And in fact, those two nations still thrive and are still at odds with each other. But regardless of that, the nations continue to thrive and continue to bless us, and God's promise is fulfilled. And having secured Isaac's position in the family and fulfilled the promise, Sarah disappears, mostly from Genesis. She plays no further role in the story of Abraham and Isaac, and the sacrifice of Isaac. Though it's interesting to speculate both what she and Isaac would have had to say about Abraham trying to sacrifice Isaac. We really only focus on Abraham's faithfulness and his test of sacrificing his son and how hard it would be to give up his son. And isn't it great that God decided against it? We don't typically get to the deeper questions of this longer story, this longer promise that Abraham had been waiting so long for his son. And it wasn't just for his son, it was for this fulfillment of this promise from God and of this covenant. And if he sacrifices that, he has lost that covenant with God. That's what he's giving up when he tries to sacrifice Isaac. That's what God is asking him to do. But we know that even if we lack faith, God is faithful and God keeps his promises. So there was no way that God was going to take away the promise or take away the covenant. He has never done so. So this is really a continuance of a much longer story. I can imagine perhaps Sarah's reaction, but this is not her test. She was tested. Her faith was tested in Egypt. When she continued with her husband's plan, she knew God would get her out of that. Her faith in this promise was tested when she gave up on the idea that it would be her fulfilling it and allowed Hagar to take part in that fulfillment and become a part of it. God's promise to her had already come to fruition with her son Isaac. So she doesn't need to be a part of this test, but Abraham, he really still didn't prove himself all the way for this. So that's why his story, I think, continues. Now, the last we really hear from Sarah is when she died at 127 in Hebron. And it's finally at this moment where Abraham buys his first real piece of property in Israel, in the Promised Land. And it's the cave of Machpelah, where he buries her, and where his sons come back to bury him beside her. She's mentioned 3 more times in the book of Genesis, and she's remembered in the prophecies of Isaiah as an ancestress of her people. And Paul uses her story and the story of Hagar as a way to describe coming into the kingdom of Christianity and the new covenant. He relates Hagar as being the line of slavery and Sarah being the line of freedom and the line of the covenant. And what he says essentially is that all those born before were of the line of slavery, were born into slavery. But we want to be born into the covenant, to be reborn as Christians and be free, and to be in this new kingdom, in this new Israel. And of course, Jewish tradition takes issue with this because it seems to kind of supersede or disregard, rather, Judaism and their part as the promised people and the chosen ones. But and to a point it does, bringing Christians above that in a sense. So those things all play a part in what Paul says, but Sarah is a very important method of showing God's promise being fulfilled and how we want to be a part of her faithfulness and of that line. So perhaps as we remember Father Abraham when we sing the old song, Father Abraham had many sons have Father Abraham. Perhaps we should also be singing about Sarah, Mother Sarah, and even Hagar, who were the founders of these nations too, whom God also made promises, and whom also showed great faith, who showed that even they had human moments. Both the women and Abraham had moments of disbelief, pettiness, rivalry, just like we do. But this story was never about their faithfulness. It's not even about Abraham's faithfulness. Like all the stories in the Bible, this is about God's faithfulness. God's ability to keep his promises despite our inability and complete failings in most bargains. The unending love of God. So I hope that you've enjoyed learning about a couple of the amazing women behind, or maybe even beside, one of the heroes of the Bible. And I hope that as you look forward to Mother's Day, that you remember an amazing mother in your life. Or that you remember the covenants that we make with God as we make promises during baptisms or marriage. That these link back to that first covenant. That God still keeps his promises to us even when we lose faith or hope or are petty. And join me in my next video when we discuss the story of Elisha and the Shunammite women. Please don't hesitate to email me with any comments or questions. I enjoy the feedback when I hear from you. For more great videos from Lakewood Presbyterian Church, visit our website or our YouTube page. And God bless. Thank you.